For those that are unfamiliar with those areas, that basically social psychology looks at people in society and how the forces that influence people's behavior. So what Professor Siegel has done with his research is looked at how we can use the science of influence and persuasion and other social psychological principles to help people who are dealing with different health issues. Really some interesting work, everything from his work that he's going to be talking about on depression to work that he's done with motor vehicle departments in terms of increasing people signing up for organ donation and so on. So some interesting stuff here. Jason, I'm going to pass it over to you to lead us in this webinar. Thank you everybody for joining us, and everybody, Professor Jason Siegel.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Much, much appreciated. Okay, welcome. Stephen just did a great job of saying, who am I? So I will not really repeat it. But what we're going to look at today is basically a 3-act play, right? We know the goal: reduce stigma, increase help seeking. But there's a lot here. So first, what is the challenge in doing this? If it was easy, it wouldn't be a webinar. Why is it such a difficult challenge? If it was easy, I wouldn't have had to spend 20 years learning how to do it. But more importantly, how can we rise to the challenge? Because is it difficult? Absolutely. Can it save lives? Absolutely. So depression is basically the leading cause of disability in the world. And this was all pre-COVID. So one can only imagine what it's looking like today. We're looking at more than 300 million people worldwide, and about 1 in 5 Americans will experience depression in their lifetime. So if we're looking at a room right now with 30 people, we could assume at least 6 of us, and I was one, so 5 other people will experience depression during their lifetime. Now, if untreated, it impairs quality of life and work. I'm currently working with hospitals across the nation, and depression is associated with burnout, less satisfaction on the job, less work engagement, less of a desire to stay at that job. And worse off, the longer depression goes untreated, the more the disorder intensifies. And when it gets as bad as it gets, this can lead to suicide. The one thing that really someone can take back, it's different than smoking a cigarette, which takes time to build up. But we all know suicide, it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem and something that we've got to reduce. 60% of people who complete suicide have some form of mood disorder. And if you think about the 16 million adults that experience depression, 4.6 million, almost more than a quarter, thought about suicide, 1.6 made plans, and 681,000 actually attempted to kill themselves from depression. Given that this is treatable, there's no need for this because we could fix this. 60%, if not 70%, of people with a disorder never seek treatment. Half the people who commit suicide do so without telling a single other person of their plans. So what's our goal? It's simple. We've got to increase help seeking among people with depression. It's a treatable illness. You treat it, the person lives a high quality life. You don't treat it, we're risking suicide. So this is what we have to do. And you would think this would be relatively easy. However, this is not necessarily the case. To understand why this is not so easy, let me tell you a little bit about depression. When someone is suffering from depression, they process all information through what's called a depressogenic schema. I know, it just rolls off the tongue. Okay, but basically what this refers to is you're going to have involuntary and consistent negative thoughts. You're going to have difficulty disengaging from those thoughts, but something that we're going to talk about shortly is that the schema doesn't affect everything equally. If there's information about other people, people with depression can process that relatively fine. It's when it's about the self, and this is going to be an important facet in some of the suggestions I'm going to put forth shortly. Also, people who are depressed have what's called a cognitive triad: negative views of themselves, their experiences, and their future. And there are also a lot of cognitive errors, particularly about self-relevant information. So what does this mean? Black and white thinking. Either I'm the best ever or I'm the worst ever. And if you're depressed, guess which way it goes. Selective abstraction. You might tell someone who is depressed 15 compliments and there'll be one neutral comment, but because of the illness, the person with depression is going to zoom in on that one negative comment. Moreover, they're going to magnify it, and then they're going to overgeneralize. Well, I failed at this, therefore I'm going to fail at everything. And it's very important to keep the schema and these cognitive errors in mind. Now, as we already said, help seeking is a good goal, but it's difficult to achieve. Why? Simple. The same depressogenic schema that we just talked about, the negative thoughts, the discounting the positive, that is the same brain, the same processor that is going to think about help seeking. So what happens? Well, unlike most ailments where normally, like, you have a toothache, you ignore it, then it gets so bad you can't sleep, then you go to the dentist. With depression, it's different. Basically, the more depressed you become, the less favorable you become towards help seeking. The more depressed you become, the less you think that good things are going to come out of help seeking. Your thoughts and your certainty about anything positive about help seeking tends to go away. The negative thoughts start dominating your mind. And not surprisingly, the more depressed people get, the less they intend to seek help. Suddenly, that number from before, that 60 to 70% don't seek help, now it's starting to make sense. That half the people who kill themselves don't tell anyone else, that's not shocking. It's sad, but it's actually quite predictable when you think about the mental state of somebody with depression. Now, here is a key thing. Certainly, increasing help seeking and reducing stigma is a great goal, but messages targeting people with depression can backfire. They can cause harm. Okay, there is sometimes a belief in health promotion. Well, just get the message out there. At a minimum, it won't be bad, but maybe it will help. No. When you're dealing with persuading people about depression, the messages can cause harm. You can harm the very group you are looking to help. Couple of quick examples. There was a study in 2009. They showed people a billboard or a TV ad or no information. Okay, this black line are the people at highest risk, the people who are most likely to think about committing suicide or having depression. What you're seeing here is that if they saw the billboard or the TV ad, the dark bar, they were less favorable towards help seeking than if they saw nothing. They were less favorable than if they saw nothing. What about this lighter bar? Those were the people who were not at risk for depression or suicide. In other words, the same message that looks good to people without depression can actually cause harm among those with it. I did a study with my graduate student, Brianna, one of my colleagues years ago. We show them this message. You're not to blame. It's treatable. As long as you're willing to seek help. What happened? Among those with depression, we accidentally and unfortunately increased self-stigma. We made it worse. Not among the people who weren't depressed, but among the people with depression. And this is such a key point. Really drive it home with a very quick video.
There's online friends. Friends to go out with on a Saturday night. Friends to hang out with and do nothing. friends who show up on moving day. And then there are the friends who'll be there if someone is dealing with a mental illness. Are you one of those friends?
Okay, this seems like a good ad, right? It's targeting the friends of people with depression. It's encouraging people to be
people with depression. So what happened? Well, some people with depression thought this video was great. I enjoyed it. It was thought-provoking. I thought the message was worthwhile. And honestly, 75% of people with depression thought this was a good ad. But what about the other 25%? Rather than inspiring me to be a better friend to those who I know are having mental health issues, it made me feel incredibly isolated. It made me feel as I would likely have no one to turn to if times got hard. It made me sad. It brought tears to my eyes. I'm not in a good place. I have no friends local to me. I will never make friends here. Black and white thinking, remember that from earlier? I need friends. I wish I had friends. I used to have friends. Put simply, a well-intended ad caused harm among 25% of the people. Now, here's the key. 23.6 of those with heightened depression said it made them feel bad. Of those without, only 1.5%. What's the take home here? If you're going to create messages to increase help seeking, and I so hope you do, you got to be careful. You got to test these, and you got to make sure they're not going to cause harm. So to summarize, there's a dire need to increase help seeking among people with depression. People have done so. We've been successful a lot of the times, but there's also been failures. So you have to understand why things go awry, and you've really got to think about how you can be successful, because you can absolutely be successful. So let's rise to this challenge, right? We can increase help seeking. Even better, we can use what we know about that depressogenic schema to our advantage. So we're going to talk about a two-pronged approach, increasing the likelihood that people with depression seek help and simultaneously reducing the stigma and increasing the support that people with depression receive. So I'm going to introduce the way to do this quite simply, the IIFF model, IIFF. Very simply, there are 4 constructs. If you can make sure these 4 constructs are present, it is very likely you will find success. Information, an immediate outreach mechanism, focused engagement, and favorable activation. And again, ideally, we want all 4 of these simultaneously, and you can make a difference. You could get your community seeking help. You can get your workers seeking help. First, information. You gotta give them information about how to recognize the symptoms. Very simply, if they don't think they're depressed, they're not going to think about seeking help. Also, by giving information out there about how to recognize the symptoms, coworkers can be on the lookout and start to see if their coworkers are experiencing depression. So you've got to get that information out there. You also have to make it clear about the illness. You've got to let people know that if they're depressed, they're not processing the way they normally would, and they're overly focused on the negative. And you've got to let the loved ones know that. It's not uncommon for some loved ones to get frustrated because they don't understand the illness. They don't understand why their loved one is only focusing on the negative. And sometimes they blame the person with depression when it's the illness. It's like blaming someone who needs glasses for their bad eyesight. Beyond that, remember, we said the more depressed people become, the less favorable they are about help seeking, the less they think it can matter. So you've got to make sure they know, A, it is treatable, and equally let them know all the places they can go to seek help. If you're not depressed, you're not going to be thinking about where to seek help typically. So when you become depressed, you don't know. And whether in your community, there's always resources. At a workplace, there's resources. You have to get this information to people and let them know, by and large, that this is possible. And again, just to slam it home, you got to make sure people know it's treatable. When you think your loved one has an ailment that is permanent, you are actually angrier at them than if you thought the ailment was temporary. Not the happiest study I've done, but we've gotten this now 6 times in 2 different countries. So you want people to know that this is treatable, not only for the depressed person, but for the loved ones, and really slam home it is not the fault of the depressed person. And they are trying. Very often, if someone's depressed, they will sleep a lot. That is part of the illness. But very often, loved ones will see their loved one sleeping and think they're not getting up, they're not trying. Trust me, when you're in the middle of a bout of depression, going from the bed to the shower takes more energy than anything else I've ever had to do without depression. And it's really key that people are aware of this, not just the depressed people, but the people who are going to support them. So these are the key bits of information that you want to get out there through emails, and we'll talk about the way to do it shortly. 2, and this is really, really key when it comes to depression. Now, this construct, we figured it out through organ donation studies. Organ donation, yes, organ donation. We did a bunch of town halls and we talked about donation, did all the stuff we like to do, and we gave everyone a donor card. And we said either A, give it to us and we'll mail it in for you, or B, you have to mail it in yourself. We did this in a couple of different cities. If we said we'll collect it from you, 40% of the people registered. When we asked them to mail it in, basically zero, nobody. Yes, that simple step of having to mail it in at a later time was enough of a barrier. This is 10 times worse with people with depression. Why? As Beck said, even though situations may be favorable and indeed may temporarily reduce dysphoria and introduce some satisfaction, the overall sense of futility persists. But I didn't see this as a negative. What I see this as is if you're able to convince someone to seek help, it's not going to last for a very long time. So you have to give them a way to seek help right then and there. The instant you get them thinking about seeking help, bam, something to click, something to call, someone to contact. If you don't give that to them, just like our 0 people who registered who registered just because we didn't collect, the effects of your intervention or your messaging will be minimized. But how do we do this? Easy. Just think about places you could give it to them. Work meetings, community meetings, classrooms, jury duty. Those are all places where you could give people information and then right away give them a chance to put their email to reach out for help. Now, even if later on they decide they didn't want to put, maybe I shouldn't have because the depression takes over, it's okay. They made first contact and now the people they contact can do the reaching out. Websites or apps, emails with a hot link, text messages, all of these provide an immediate and complete mechanism to register for a help-seeking class and to reach out. Now, one key thing, make sure you let them know it could be anonymous or confidential. Now, this is a bit tricky. You want to do that because they're going to be very often, not always, but some people with depression don't want other people to know. However, so you want to give that to them, but you don't want to make it seem as if they should be embarrassed. So you want to just subtly say that it can be confidential if desired, but not harp on it. Just really do it quickly and move from there. So now we're going to give people a ton of information about recognition, it not being their fault, that it's treatable and how to get help. And when we do that, we're going to simultaneously give them an immediate mechanism for registration. But that's just the II. Remember, it's IIFF. Focused engagement. You've got to get people focused on your message. Okay, again, if it's a work meeting, community, required content, work email from the head boss, right? Training, or make it unexpected. When things shock us or surprise us, we then go deeper. What I'm saying here is just because you put out a message, it doesn't mean anyone's going to listen to the message. Just because there's an email, it doesn't mean someone's going to read it. So just as hard as you focus on the type of information and putting that immediate mechanism, you want to create contexts where they're going to engage with the material. You gotta make sure they're going to engage. This is a really key part of this. Finally, favorable activation. As I showed before with that ad, when 23.6% of people with depression felt bad after seeing that message, but only 1% of those without felt bad, people with depression process information differently than those without it. How you provide the information, that makes a huge difference. Now, the good thing is we know how to minimize the depressogenic schema. Beck, Wisco, a whole bunch of researchers have thankfully spent their career figuring this out. What do they say about the depressogenic schema? Minimize self-relevance and defensiveness. As I mentioned earlier, if it's about other people, the person with depression will process less to a lesser capacity through the depressogenic schema. Now, so this was the clinical people. Here's the advantage of playing with different realms of psychology. Persuasion people in the 60s said it's widely believed that a communication, if inadvertently overheard, is likely to be more effective in changing the opinion of the listener than if it had been deliberately addressed. In other words, if you overhear someone saying good things about you, you believe it much more because you weren't the intended recipient. So what do we do with this? Simple. Don't say, are you experiencing depression? Say, do you know someone experiencing depression? You shall let them know, because now the message is not about the depressed person, technically. It's to someone else and they overheard it. Now, look, we did a campaign that did this. What are you looking at here? This was the direct message. So their intentions to seek help from a romantic partner. When we gave them a message that said, are you depressed? The more depressed they were, the less likely they were to seek help. But aha, what happened if they got the message that said, do you know someone fighting depression? Help-seeking intentions actually went up. Yes, that simple change. The simple change between are you experiencing depression and do you know someone experiencing depression was the difference between them being less likely to seek help from a close friend and them being more likely to seek help from a close friend. These are the most depressed people. The most depressed had an average of like 2.5 on a scale of 1 to 7. Those who got the overheard message, over a 6. Simple word changes matter. Now, the other thing is minimizing self-distancing, minimize self-relevance. We just talked about the overheard. Here's another way, self-distancing. Basically, we ask people to think about a time they've been feeling down and considering asking for help. We either said to a self-immersive, what were you thinking, and replay the moment, or we said, think about how a neutral third party would advise you. What would a trusted other say to you about your situation? So these were the two different conditions. Either what would you do or what would someone tell you to do? Once again, if this is help seeking, basically, if they were in the distancing condition and they were told what would a friend tell you to do, boop, was significantly better than if they were asked what they would do or the control group. On the flip side, look at self-stigma. By just saying what a loved one would tell them to do, stigma dropped the more depressed they got versus the top line, which is stigma getting worse the more depressed they got in the control condition. Simple word changes could be the difference. So We also want to minimize activation of negative thoughts. When someone's depressed, if something negative gets in their head, it's hard to get out. We did a study. We either asked people to write about why help seeking it could be good or why the negative challenges could be overcome. Help seeking is good, worked 3 times. Why they could overcome the challenges, never worked. 0, nothing. It actually caused harm a little bit. Okay, the other thing is maximize effortful processing. The more effortful the thinking, the less of an influence the depressogenic schema would have. With the self-distancing, we did writing tasks. Those worked. When we show them a video, it didn't work. It wasn't engaging enough. So we're going to make it engaging. We're going to get effortful processing. We're going to make them think it's going to someone else, and that can have an impact. Make it interactive, make them write, make them do things. Any of those things could make it more effortful. So here's the beautiful thing. You might be thinking, wait, you didn't talk about stigma at all. I didn't have to. Why? Because if you create these ads, do you know someone fighting depression? You should let them know this. If you say, do you know someone fighting depression? You might hear the symptoms. That is going to reduce stigma as well. The exact same ads that are going to be mistargeted so people with depression don't think you're targeting them, great. Target everyone else. It's going to change how they think. It's going to convince them that things are treatable. Think about all the things we said before, right? Make them know it's treatable. Let them know it's not their fault. Let them know you know they're trying. That is actually the playbook for reducing stigma. So you could do it the same way, but of course, beware of the backfiring. Stigma messages could also backfire without a doubt. Now, just so you see, this is something that we did at CGU. These were posters that we pilot tested. Do you know someone experiencing depression? Remind them it could become overcome. Feelings of depression can be temporary. Do you know someone? Remind them it's not their fault. Sometimes even getting out of bed can be a struggle. Remind them it's not their fault. Living with depression is harder than they realize. It can be overcome. We tested these messages. What happened? We increased help seeking and we simultaneously reduced stigma. This was an experiment. We then put them up all over CGU. They were everywhere. When? March 1st. What happened? COVID. So we don't know what exactly happened here. COVID took it away. Very sad. Okay. So what does this look like in practice? Simple. You could do a group meeting in a classroom, in a work department, in a community group. Get everyone, whoever wants to come, get them. Then, or require it, even better. Talk about depression. Talk about how to recognize it in others. Talk about it not being the fault of the person. The effort that it's not due to a lack of effort, that it's treatable, and let them know resources. This is where you start, and everything's going to be about how do you help people with depression. That's how this gets framed so that the defensiveness goes down. Then as an activity, ask everyone to write out 2 reasons they think someone with depression should seek help. Then ask them to make an argument about why that would be a good thing. That's it. At the end of this, when you give them the writing task, you say, we're going to collect these. You put a little space that says, do you know someone who needs help? Or would you like us to contact you? Give us your email. That's it. A simple 30-minute meeting could hit everything I talked about, could minimize the depressogenic schema, could reduce stigma and give information, check. Immediate mechanism, check. Focused engagement, they're in a room together, you're watching them, check. Favorable activation, check. So look, persuading people with depression to seek help and reducing stigma, it's hard, it's risky, but it can be done. Remember the IIFF model. Get the information. Give them immediate access to outreach. Make sure they're focused on what you're doing and make sure there's favorable activation. Yes, harm can be done if you're not careful with these messages, but if you do it right, you can save lives. You can save the lives of your community. You can save the lives of your workforce. You really can make a difference. It is possible. Thank you guys so very, very much. I am here for questions.
Thank you very much, Jason. Excellent talk and really interesting, personally relevant as someone whose father suffered depression his entire life. The first question we've got for you is, with this IIFF model, which is, I mean, the four components make a lot of sense when you describe them. The question, when wondering how that would work with a one-on-one. So if you've got an employee that seems like they're depressed, how would you use that, or could you use that IIFF model with a one-on-one situation?
1,000%. It would actually be ideal with the one-on-one. Just sometimes people don't have the resources. So a lot of the things that we just went over in that slide, you would do exactly those things. You would talk to them about the symptoms of depression, get them to recognize it in themselves as their others, talk to them about the fault, everything, give them the resources, and then basically either right then and there say, have them do the activity, say, look, I understand you might be hesitant to seek help, but do me a favor, just give me 2 reasons why someone else might want to seek help. Okay, now let's say you had to convince them as to why that would be a good thing. Let's role play. Do me a favor, do that with me. Let's role play it. And then right then and there, you say, look, how about we sign you up? How about we make a phone call together? How about we get you into therapy? And just to give you an example of how powerful that is, we're doing a study right now in a hospital where residents are basically either right away put into a therapy session that they could opt out of, or they have to choose to go in. The data is incredible. When they have to opt out, the vast majority actually go. But if they had to do it themselves, they wouldn't. So I would end this by saying, let's make an appointment right now. Let's not, you know what, you could cancel later if you want to, but let's make this appointment. So you give them the information, you give them that immediate mechanism, they'll be focused because it's one-on-one, and it'll be favorable activation because you're going to be asking them to think about what someone else would do to minimize the schema.
Excellent, thank you. Next question is about help seeking in other types of illnesses or situations, problems. Do these same principles apply to other sorts of help seeking behavior?
I think they do. Does it work? If you think about it, the information is always key, right? If someone doesn't know they have anxiety, if someone doesn't know they have an eating disorder, we're not going to seek help to fix something unless we know. I don't go to change my oil until that lamp comes on, right? It looks like Aladdin. I rub it. I don't get 3 wishes. So the information is always key. The immediate access, absolutely. It worked in organ donation. It worked here. Those are 2 pretty broad topics. And people do change their mind. I mean, we've all been there, right? You get, you're in a certain space. You think this is a good idea. You walk out. What was I thinking? Or the other thing. So you want them to do it. The focused engagement, yes. And this is something a lot of people forget about. They just put up posters and they think the information is going to get to people. And we are bombarded with things. I do a lot of work with DMVs, and they told me the one thing they hate the most are cell phones because nobody looks up anymore. So you really got to think about that. And the favorable activation, yes. Now, favorable activation might vary for different capacities. If I'm trying to put a smoker in a good place, that might be different than an organ donor or someone with depression. So there might be some tailoring, but the 4 components absolutely make a huge difference, I think, regardless of the context.
Excellent, thank you. Next question here is from Christina, who asks, is it possible to maximize the depressed person's well-being during a period of good mental health so that they have a game plan for when the mental health is not so good?
I would certainly never discourage that. I mean, I think that's a very good thing. And the other advantage of that is that if you do that, they could actually then be a helper for other people, right? Just having that conversation alone is going to reduce stigma. I mean, that's the beauty of this. Just by saying there are all these resources available, what you're doing is you're increasing the norm of people that need the resources, which reduces stigma. Now, one of the challenges is, and I can just speak from personal experience, what I believe when I'm not depressed is night and day from what I believe when I'm depressed. Once depression kicks in, it is a very different brain that you're dealing with. So will it necessarily be something they could go back to when they're not feeling depressed? Maybe, maybe not, but it might. And the benefits to stigma and then helping others is so robust that I couldn't, like, I think that's a great thing to do. And I would say, don't let the fact that it may not be as helpful if they're in a deep depression stand in your way, because there is a vast amount of benefits.
Yeah, good, good, thank you. Final question we've got here is, when you've got a person who seems to be reluctant, and you've tried stuff, what do you do at that point? You know, if what you've tried, I guess the question is, if what you tried doesn't work, what do you do? What is your recommendation then?
It's, you know, it's clearly very situational. Um, but I think the key thing is, by and large, if someone is depressed, you want to do all you can to get them in touch with a professional if possible. The importance of that goal just cannot be understated. So sometimes what we do, you know, is you can if you can ask that person if you can go with them to the appointment, ask that person if you could make the appointment for them, ask that person. I mean, when you're fighting depression, you're really afraid of letting people down. It's just you think you've let everyone down. So if you tell someone who's depressed, it will mean a lot to me, and you could do me a really big favor if you and I can just get online and make an appointment and go see it. So in a way, use the social capital that you have, and the fact that the person with depression will not, want to let you down. The other thing is really try to, when you're depressed, the last thing you want to do often is get out, is to walk. But walking around and a little bit of exercise and actually getting out is so good. And that's one of the things, because think about that: when you're depressed, your brain constricts, no cognitive flexibility, all negative thought. Any exercise, even a good song sometimes, could broaden it for a little bit. Now, it does go back, but you want to think, what can I do to give a temporary window? You're not going to cure the person. You're not going to, get them happy or non-depressed for life, but try to think about, what can I do to open a short-term window? Music, walking, exercise. Any of those things might be enough to, or even writing. Here's one thing that we did that actually worked really well: writing about a time. Elevation, it's an emotion that really opens you up. So ask people to write about or tell you about a time they saw someone do something good for someone else. When someone talks about someone doing good for something else, they get elevated. They actually, the positive thoughts start to come in. So my best advice is, think about the different ways to open that window for just a short time. Once it's open, get an appointment, get them to commit to you, get them to a therapist or any of those things before that window closes. So don't think long-term cure, think short-term window, and then get them to act within that window.
Really interesting, Jason. And just to clarify, that notion of elevation they're not thinking about a time that something good has happened to them. It's when they've seen something good happen to someone else. Is that what you said?
Yes, and I so appreciate that question, because when we first tested this, we tested versus elevation, seeing someone do something good for someone else, and gratitude. Don't do gratitude, please. You know why? If you ask someone to think about a time someone did something good for them and they're depressed, they feel guilt. Not everyone, but a lot of people feel guilty. Oh, well, there was that one time my mom did all this stuff for me and I wasn't worth it. We actually did a study where we asked people to write about a time they felt betrayed, or about a time depressed people with depression, their loved one was there for them. They both felt equally bad as a result. Non-depressed people at work, great. They felt just as bad writing about a time someone did good for them as when they wrote about when they felt betrayed. So yes, I am so glad you asked that. Please don't ask about gratitude. Ask about a time they saw someone do something good for somebody else.
Excellent. Really interesting. A fantastic webinar, Jason. Thank you. At this time, it seems like a message like this is so important for all of us. I've been talking to a number of people who have said that in their workplaces, as people are coming back in, there's this almost this sense of letdown that we expected things to be better with society opening up. We expected, I don't know whether it was fireworks or whatever, but it feels like it's a letdown now that we're moving back to opening up, at least for some people. Not saying everybody. And I think that the part of your message today really could be powerful for how do we help people who are struggling at the tail end of the pandemic? Because maybe that's part of what you're talking about, that here's a time when we all should be feeling good because the pandemic is winding down, and that can make some people feel even worse, I suppose.
You know, absolutely. And expectation violations are really powerful. You know, sometimes if you're sad, it's not because your situation is actually bad. It's not what you, it's worse than you expected or not as good. So I think it's key for people working with the community and with workers, you got to be proactive. The people with depression are not going to reach, or it will be unlikely to reach out. You got to be proactive and really, I mean, ideally, and I'm sure everyone on the call would do it just for humanitarian reasons, but if not, the more depressed, the more burnout, the less they want to stay with an organization. So I know sometimes trustees want to know about the bottom line. The bottom line is that doing outreach will actually save you money and give you a better workplace.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you, everybody, for joining in our webinar this week. If you have any questions on any of this, please reach out to us. We're going to have our final webinar in the series next week with Professor Jeremy Hunter, who's going to be talking to us same time next week. Until then, I hope you have a wonderful week, people. Take good care.
Thank you, everyone.